What's up animators, Sharp here and welcome to the last part of the Abandoned House Beginner Blender course. In the last part we did the UVs, we finished up the textures, learned how to shader objects, we added some Ivy, learned how to manage add-ons, the asset library, and went a little deeper into how to create textures, texture painting, multiple UVs, and all that good stuff. It was a pretty packed episode. Again, if you have any questions, drop it down in the comments, but also share your progress in my Discord server. I'm pretty active in there and I want to see what you've made. I want to see how you use this course. Plus, you can get help and feedback from the community, so it's a great place. Join us! But today we are finishing the course by finalizing the lighting, adding some simulations like grass wiggle, fireflies. We'll add actual moss to the roof. We'll add volumetric fog, learn how to use the compositor, and finally hit that render button and see the final product. I keep hitting this microphone. If you like this course, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, spread the word, but now let's begin. We'll start by adding the actual moss to the roof, and for that we need to do some texture painting again. And if you remember, our UVs for the roof tiles are all over the place. So once again, we'll have to use double UV maps. But we have multiple roof objects, and to prevent myself from doing this multiple times, I'll just merge all of them into a single object with Ctrl J. Then I'll go into the Object Data tab and give this a new UV map and properly rename it. With the new UV map selected, I'll just smart project the UVs onto the whole thing. So everything is set in the 1x1 Udem square, and I'll use this UV map to paint the texture and the other UV map for all the other textures on the roof. Let's hop into the shader editor, box and rename this current material for organization, and quickly create a simple moss material. Add a principal BSDF, add a noise texture with mapping, run it through a color ramp, give it some moss color, play with the noise settings, and add more colors if you want. Just stick to similar colors we already have in the scene, so this all feels like the same environment for the moss to grow equally. Put the noise to the bump node in the height input, and plug it into the normal, and bring down the distance to drop the intensity. Increase the roughness because moss is not reflective, and this should be good enough. Now add a mix shader and connect the original material to the first socket and moss to the second. For the factor input, we'll paint a custom image texture. So add an image texture node, click new, give it a 2K resolution, and rename it, then click OK. Now add a UV map node, pick the new unwrapped UV map we just made, and plug it into the image's vector input. This way, the painted mask will use the new UVs, and because the active one is the original tiled one, the rest will just use that by default. Plug your image mask into the factor input. Now select the image texture, select the roof, and hop into texture paint mode. Now, because we're not splitting this image into 3 separate channels, because we only have one texture to add on top of this, we'll just paint with white. Pure black and white. And don't be an idiot like me, not realizing why I can't paint without checking that my brush intensity was all the way down. Shift F, people. Make sure your brush actually paints. Now I'll paint in some moss splotches, mainly in the cavities, but I'll add random blobs all over as well. Now we'll add actual moss hairs onto this painted moss. It's not going to be too visible because of the angle, but it's a nice little mechanic that I get to explain. Switch the shader editor into the UV editor window and preview the moss texture we just painted. We have to save that as an image file so it doesn't disappear next time we open Blender. Now, hair particles don't use the same materials as normal objects, so we have to make a new material for the moss hair, but I want it to be using the same colors as our original moss. So I'll copy these nodes with Ctrl and C, make a new material here, which I'll call moss material, paste the nodes in so it's an identical setup, and replace the principal BSDF for the principal hair node. Plug the color into the color and you're good. Now we'll add a hair particle system to the roof, which will assign the moss material and use this painted texture as the density input. So the moss hair will only appear where the moss is painted and you'll use the same colors as the painted moss. So add the hair particle system, we've done this a million times now, and under the render dropdown, the render material should be the moss material. So the object has the roof tiles material, but the particle system has the moss hair material. Under the children dropdown, I'll choose interpolated, so I get more hair without actually having more hair. And I'll drop down the length. I'm making moss now. Moss is very short. Now open the texture tab and create a new texture, which is going to be an image or movie. Now instead of creating a new image texture, click on the dropdown to pick from the existing ones. And of course choose the moss paint that we've just painted. I'll also rename it so it makes sense. Now because we've assigned this texture onto the roof model, if we go back into particle systems and scroll down to the texture section, we can detect this texture. Assign it to the first slot. Now, because it's present in the particle system, we can make it affect anything we want. Open the texture tab again, and in the mapping tab, change the coordinates to UV, and choose the unwrapped UV so it's placed exactly the same as our painted mask. Now that everything is in place, we can drop down the influence tab and tick on density. Now the moss's density is driven by the same texture that we used to paint the roof with. And if we were to paint on the mask now, it would also update the particle system automatically. Now I'll match my viewport display in the Children tab to the render display so I can see exactly what I'm doing, and crank the number of particles until I get a nice fuzzy looking moss. And of course hop into render mode to see what it looks like. It's a little bit dark because I'm in isolated mode and my sun lamp is not visible, but there's not enough moss. So I'll crank the number even higher. Obviously, you know your computer's limit, so don't push it too hard if you think you can't handle it. Mine can though, so work, you little I'm joking, sorry, I love you. By the way that I made this isolated render section is by pressing Ctrl B and then dragging a box. And the way you turn it off is by pressing Ctrl Alt and B. This comes in handy because it renders way faster because it's a small square. Now I'll turn my particle system off for the viewport, but keep it on for the render. So it's not gonna lag my viewport, but it's still gonna be there when I hit render. Looking at the whole scene, I'll make adjustments to the moss color and apply those changes to the moss hair material as well. You know, always make small tweaks. And now we'll finally tackle the lighting. Delete this lousy sun lamp, no more placeholder, bad. And now go to polyhaven.com and open the HDRI section. And HDRI is a high dynamic range 360-degree image, which because of its high dynamic range can be used as a light source in your 3D scene. They're usually 32-bit, which means they can really differentiate between light sources and everything else, which means you get accurate shadows as if you were really there. I'm gonna pick one which only contains the sky, not to get unwanted reflections anywhere in the scene. Resolution of 4K and format as EXR, and download. Now open the World tab here next to the background color, press the yellow dot and choose Environment Texture. Open and browse for the HDRI we just downloaded. Now that we're in material mode, we can drop down this menu and turn on Scene World. We need to see if the HDRI is rotated properly. And here I can see that the sun is on the wrong side, so I have to rotate this manually. Open the shader editor and up here where it says Object, turn this into World. Click on the environment texture and press Ctrl and T to add the mapping nodes. Now if you just rotate this on the Z-axis, I can rotate it so the sun is in the same place as it was before. I'll save the project under a new name again, so I have a backup, and hop into render mode. It feels too yellow, so I'll add a hue saturation value node after the image to see if it even works, and I might be crazy, but I think this actually made a difference. I don't know, you tell me. I'll also bring up the HDRI strength to make it all brighter. Now in Blender 4.0, we got a new color space that handles light fall off way better than before. So go into the Render Settings tab and scroll down to the color management. Change the filmic color transform, which we had before, to AGX. Here's a comparison between the two. I'm also gonna give it a little bit of contrast in the look and mess with the exposure and gamma. Back into material mode and turn off the scene world. We're now gonna add volumetric fog. I'll hop into solid mode and add a cube, which I'll name Fog. And also turn off the cavity shading while we're at it. We don't need that anymore. Now imagine that the fog is inside the cube. Scale the cube so it covers the part of the scene where you want your fog to be. Give the cube a new material and call it Fog. Now in the shader editor, go back into the object settings. Delete the principal BSDF and replace it with principal volume. Set a fog color and plug the output not into the surface, but into the volume. We're making volumetric fog. Now I'll hop into render mode to see it, and it's definitely way too strong. So I'll drop down the density more and more until it looks good. I'll now hop into solid mode and open another window on the right, where I'll hop into camera view and disable all gimbals and overlays. I'll bring this edge of the fog down so it starts lower at the floor and slowly rises up. I'll also add subdivisions and model a rough shape of the fog using soft select tools. Once I'm done, I'll go into object data and viewport display, then change the display as mode to wire. So this object is displayed as wireframe while everything else is displayed as normal, so it doesn't get in the way. Or even better, just bounce. Go to render view again and play with intensity. I'll also put the anisotropy to around 0.6 because it'll help with the light fall off of the fireflies when we add them. I'll turn on all the trees in the grass so I can see what it looks like. And now I can see that I can bring the fog up even more. This is a constant tug of war between corrections and changes. I'm trying to make it look good when everything's in the scene and also adjust my fog as I'm doing that. I'm also modifying the fog as we go, and I've settled for this shape in the end. I also gave the chimneys the bevel modifier because the texture is so worn, so the model should also be more rounded and old. Now I'll turn my HDRI around even more since we have a tree in the foreground which will cast some interesting shadows onto the house. I want to turn it just enough so the extruded part of the house is still in the sunlight, which will help define the shape of the house. And then I'll manually move the tree around to get a better shadow. Then I'll duplicate it and move it on the other side and further back so only the top of the tree casts a shadow on the house. And a third tree to add some shadows on the floor. We want to make this look like it's in the middle of the forest, so things that are off camera that are casting shadows do matter when it comes to the perception. Now I think the fog should be more blue to make this scene more cold and fresh, so I've upped the saturation on that. I also don't like the wood color too much anymore, so I've added a brightness and contrast note and messed with the values until I got this. I then added another cube and call it Fog 2. This will only stay close to the floor to exaggerate the fog close to the ground. Duplicate this material and make it less saturated. Give it subdivisions and give it a displacement modifier only on the z-axis. Give it a texture, which is going to be the clouds texture, and mess with the settings until you get a nice variation. Then set the display to bounce. Now let's make this grass wiggle. Turn off all the particle systems on the floor except for your grass. If you scroll down the particle systems, you'll find field weights. These are external force fields which can affect the simulations, such as wind, magnetism, and so on, and all of their influences are set to 1. Select the scene collection because we're adding a new item, which is going to be a force field, and a wind one. This should add a circular icon with 2 arrows, which is your wind force field. This should now interact with your particles. My project is a little bit laggy because of all the stuff that I've added in so far, but I'll move the force field up and rotate it so it's facing the grass. And since the shape of the wind is apparently a plane, I'm not sure if that's a global plane beyond this point, or if the plane is as big as my icon, so I'll scale it up just in case. But no matter how much I crank up the strength of the wind, the grass does not move. Because in the hair particle system, you need to turn on hair dynamics, where you have all the other settings. Inside structure, you've got vertex mass. We're working with grass, and grass is very light, so let's drop this weight down so it behaves more like grass. Now I'll add another force field, which is going to be my turbulence. It looks like a cross, and turbulence is generally just some noise in the wind. When we combine the wind with turbulence, it should give us some nice flowing noise in the grass. Let's bring up the strength so we can see the effect better, but that makes my grass bigger for some reason instead of wiggling. What's the problem? We can't preview the animation normally because of all the lag, so let's make what's called a Playblast. Open the Output Properties tab and set up an output location where the animation will be exported. Mine will be on the desktop because I'm planning on deleting this afterwards. Set the format to FFmpeg video, and in the encoding dropdown, set it to MPEG 4. And also set the end frame to 100 so we don't have to sit through this entire thing. Then drop down View and click on Viewport Render Animation. This will render the animation through your viewport, so it's gonna render solid mode with all the overlays on, as well as the current position of your camera. This is great because we get to preview the movements without having to wait for all the long render times. The animation should export frame by frame. I forgot to record myself watching the Playblast, but you should get a video file in your output location without any lag or anything. The problem is that while using hair dynamics, the rotation has to be set to velocity hair since it's simulated. The reason that the grass is growing whenever I play the animation is because I've put seriously enormous values in the force fields. So the grass is stretching to keep up with the insane forces applied. I was correct. Next order of operation. The turbulence field is static and will always give the same noise pattern. So we're going to animate it moving across to give us more of a wavy grass. Grab it and move it down here. Then hover the position values in the end sidebar and press I to give all of them a keyframe. Then move to frame 40 or so and move the turbulence field on the X and Y axes, and then hover the position values again and press I to add the second keyframe. Now let's quickly hop into the graph editor on our timeline, while the turbulence field is still selected. This graph shows us the motion curves of the turbulence field. It's a little confusing at first, but I'll try my best to explain it, since this course is not really focused on animation and movement. Since I don't know what to include in the forest scene that would require animation, and I'm not really good at making animals. The different colors represent the X, Y, and Z values. From left to right, we've got time, and for up and down, we've got values for these attributes. For example, here on frame 1, the value of Y position is somewhere around -10, and by the time we get to frame 40, it's close to 0. In between frame 1 and 40, we can see a little slope, meaning it's slowly moving from one point to the other. But the slope is eased on both ends, meaning it starts slowly, then speeds up, and then slows down in the end. I want the movement of my turbulence field to be consistent. No slows or stops, just traveling with equal speed. There isn't much time here to explain exactly how everything works, so just select all the keyframes, press V to bring up this menu, and select Vector. This will turn all the Bezier handles of the keyframe towards each other, so you get a straight line, meaning that motion is applied equally everywhere. If you want a more in-depth tutorial of the graph editor, let me know in the comments and I might make it in the future. But now the turbulence field will only move for the first 40 frames, then it's gonna stop. I want this to be constant and I don't yet know how long my animation is gonna be, so I just wanna I just want this to move on forever, for as long as I need. Just like you can give modifiers to your geometry, which will update automatically, you can also add modifiers to your animation curves. In the end sidebar of the graph editor, you've got a modifiers tab, where you can add a modifier. Choose cycles, which will cycle the animation over and over before and after the first and last keyframe. The modifier will be applied to our selected attributes. Now change this repeat motion value to repeat motion with offset. This will continue the motion into the same direction endlessly. Do that for before and after for both X and Y. Now the turbulence field will move endlessly, and we can adjust how fast by bringing the keyframes closer together or further apart, because it's just gonna extend that motion anyway. Now I'll bring back my grass particles and play the animation back. It looks fine in my laggy viewport. Now to stop the randomness in my simulation, I'll drop down the cache section, set my frame range, and then click the bake button. This will run the simulation and bake all of those results. So it's no longer being simulated, but rather playing back the same bake over and over. This way you get consistent results and less lag. But I have way too many things in the scene already, so it's not gonna help me with the lag front much. If you want to make changes to the simulation, first you have to delete the bake, make changes, and once you're happy, then bake it again. You can also proceed without ever baking your simulation, but that's always going to give you some sort of randomness, and sometimes there might be errors in the render, which you don't want. Since my scene is too laggy, I'll render the viewport animation again to see what it looks like. Now on my desktop, I got the rendered clip, and when I play it, I can see that the grass wiggle is extremely fast and it wiggles by a lot. Which means I must turn down the strength of my turbulence field, the wind field, and make the turbulence field move slower as well. I'll do that by first clicking on Normalize, which will display all the graph curves inside in a range from -1 to 1. These aren't actual values in the 3D viewport, this is just a display, so it's easier to see all of it. I'll grab the last keyframe and move it up on the y-axis to about 1/3 of the whole motion. It will instantly jump back down because of the normalize option we turned on, but the movement has still been made and the slope is now less intense. Do the same with the y-axis, move the last keyframe down. If I turn off the normalize option now, we can see the lines are much more horizontal now than it went before. We could have moved them without the normalize option, but I wanted to show you that as well. Now delete the Playblast on my desktop and render viewport animation again. Watching the Playblast, the grass is still quick, but less than before. So I'll drop the wind strength, increase the turbulence size so it's less noisy, and bring the X and Y values on the turbulence noise even closer in, so it's even slower. Quick shortcut: to quickly swap between the timeline and the graph editor, you can press Ctrl and Tab while hovering it. I use this a lot, it's a time saver. Now put the start to frame 5, since the grass always starts laying down before any of the forces have been applied. Want to cut that out. And also make the animation shorter, so I have to wait less time when exporting. Render viewport animation again, and with simulations it's just an endless loop of corrections, so I'll just skip all of this until I get something interesting. Grass was still fast, but better than before. Drop the wind, drop the turbulence, re-render the viewport. The grass seems fine now, but it speeds at the start and slows down. So I'll start the animation at 30 now to get the initial speed ramp out of the way. Re-render, grass speeds up and comes to a full stop. So I went back and forth making little tweaks. The wiggle too fast, slow down the movement of the turbulence noise. Wiggle too intense, drop down the strength. And then I finally had something nice. I decided to drop the amount of children and increase the number of actual particles, so more of them are real and actually simulated so I can get a better result. I turned on all the other particle systems and rendered the viewport again. This is what I got. I'm also going to adjust the color of the bush using the hue saturation method to match the rest of the foliage. And this particular brush is made up of 4 different materials, so I have to apply this to all of them individually. But what are you gonna do? This is the model that I got. At least I didn't have to make it from scratch. And then I'm gonna change all the grass's color to match the foliage even better, and this made a huge difference. But now the trees are very reddish and they're very noisy. This is an issue with subsurface scattering. I made this in the previous version, but in 4.0, the amount of subsurface scattering is the weight slider, the radius is the scale slider, and the individual RGB radius is still the same, just not hidden in a weird dropdown. And the rest you don't have to worry about. These are individual RGB colors, and right now, we have a lot of red and a tiny amount of green and blue. Remember the additive light mixing. We want a lot of green and a little bit of red on the side. But it looks like this strange red tint just went away after I dropped red down, so I guess that works fine. So just drop down the red for all the trees and bring up the green if you must. And we're back to reshaping the fog model. Something about this just doesn't feel right. I'm just dropping and raising different parts up where I want more or less fog. This somehow feels better now. Corrections. Now I'll save the project with a different name again because we're entering the finishing touches. This is the home run. Now we're adding the Fireflies. Make a new collection and call it Fireflies. Inside the collection, add a new item, which is going to be an icosphere. Put its subdivisions down to level 1 so it's really low poly, and bring it down below the floor. This will be our instance for the Fireflies, and it's gonna be really tiny, so we don't need a lot of geometry on them. Rename it to Firefly Particle and give it a new material, which you should swap out for the emission material. Here, give it a goldish or an orange-ish color and hide it. Now I'm gonna add a torus of all things and rename it to Firefly Spawner. The reason it's a torus is because Firefly is gonna spawn from either the faces or the volume of your mesh, and I want my Fireflies to spawn outside of the house. Scale it up, I'll disable the trees for now, select the torus and give it a particle system. This time, leave it on emitter. Drop the number down to 200 or so. Now I'll make everything in my scene invisible so I can get my frame rate up a little bit, because at this point the project is so slow I can barely do anything with it. Now select the torus and in the field weights, drag select everything and set it all to 0 to disable all the force field effects. If we play the animation, we see particles slowly being spawned from the torus and shifting away because the velocity is set to normal, which is pushing them away from the faces they spawned on. Open the render tab and make this summon as an object, which is the Firefly particle. Mess with the scale and increase the number of particles. Then in the source dropdown, make it emit from the volume rather than the faces, so they spawn on the inside of the torus. And in the viewport display, turn off Show Emitter, which will hide the torus and only show the particles. Now in the Physics tab, instead of Newtonian, I'll be using Boids. Newtonian physics is a model that follows standard physics, gravity, collisions, and so on, but Boids is a smart system that gives your particle behaviors. You can give them a chain of commands they follow and create custom ecosystems. You can also make them fight and give them health bars and stuff. It's really crazy. But today we'll only use some basic movement commands. Drop down Boid Brain. Right now they have 2 commands. First, they separate from each other and then they flock, meaning they kind of mirror what other Boids are doing, just doing their own thing. And while watching this, I realized that the particles keep spawning and I don't want that. I want all of the Fireflies to all be there in the beginning and remain there till the end. No spawning or disappearing. So let's scroll up to the emission part and see what's up. We currently have 1,000 particles which start spawning at frame 1 and stop spawning at frame 200. Each particle lives for 50 frames. We want frame start and frame end to both be at 29, so they all summon at once before the animation even starts. I've written 30 and 31 because I was still trying things out when I was recording this, but both at 29 is the better option and you'll see why in the future. And the lifetime of these particles should be 400 or something, so they can live throughout this entire duration of the animation. Now the Boids are still separating and flocking. That's not the behavior we want. Scroll down and remove these commands. Then add a new one. Follow leader is an interesting one. They'll always follow a certain object. I'll add a new empty object real quick, place it inside the house and call it Firefly Target. Then in the Boid system under Follow Leader, I'll pick the object for the leader, which will be the Firefly Target, obviously. Now they all flock towards the leader, but I don't want them to go through the house. So I'll add a next rule, which is Avoid, and the object to avoid will be the house base. I'll turn on Predict so they see it sooner, and bring up the fear factor so they for sure avoid the house. But they're not listening. So I'll raise the rule fuzziness on the avoid to make sure the Boids are 100% going to follow this rule. But it looks like they don't care. I'm guessing the follow the leader is messing with them because it's contradicting the avoid rule and they don't know what to do in that situation. And I should probably replace it with flock or something, but that's not what I did when I was recording this video. I tried removing the follow leader rule entirely, but the Boids just wouldn't move. I've tried moving the Firefly target off screen and re-adding the follow leader and replacing the torus geometry to a big cube. But the Boids were passing right through the house and they all flocked onto one side. They look nice on screen, but they're not doing what I want. I'll come back to that, but for now I've noticed that we don't have any camera blur present in the scene. Depth of field. So I'll add a new empty object to the scene, call it Camera Focus, and plop it right on the front face of the house. Then I'll turn on render mode and select the camera. In the depth of field dropdown under the focus object, select the camera focus object we just made. Now the camera's focus distance is going to be set on that camera focus object. So it's going to focus on the front face of the house. And everything else is going to be blurred based on the camera aperture. This works much like a real camera with a number of aperture blades is going to affect the shape of the bokeh. I'll put it to 8 because 8 is the most common for most cameras. And for the f-stop, I'll put it to something low like 0.5 to show you how blurry it gets with lower numbers. This is physically impossible though, so I'll put it to something more reasonable. Something like an f-stop of 3.5. That's a normal consumer camera. These are photography terms and it helps if you understand photography, but if you don't, smaller number means more blur. Big number means no blur. Just know that the f-stop of 2 is very unlikely, and you'll never find anything above f-stop 64. That's also pretty extreme. So that's the range. Let's come back to our particle spawner. In the physics tab, drop down movement. Change the max air velocity to something small, like 2, so all of them are gonna move very slowly. They can't go faster than this. Okay, that's enough. We'll come to that again. I don't want to deal with this. Let's animate the camera instead. Select the camera, hover the position attributes, and press I to add a keyframe. Then add a keyframe for rotation as well. It's a good time before you do any animation to go into the output properties panel and change the frame rate to 25, because this is what we'll export in. Then move to something like frame 155, and in the camera view, press Shift and F to activate our flying camera shortcut, which we've set at the start of the course. And slightly inch the camera closer by pressing W, or you can move it manually. Then hover the position attributes and press I to add the second keyframe. And for the rotation, I've only moved the X-axis, so I only want to give the keyframe to the rotation X value. So right-click and select Insert Single Keyframe, which will only make a keyframe for that one attribute. Hop into the graph editor and turn off the rotation values for now. Select everything, press V, and choose Vector, so everything is linear, the camera is cinematic. Turn off the position keyframes and bring back the rotation keyframes, and at this point we can just delete rotation Y and Z, because we're not using it. Now bring up the X rotation. I want to keep this motion eased, so the movement is constant but the rotation is not. I'll take these Bezier handles and bring them in a little so the move is more intense. Now I'll turn off the overlays and render the viewport animation again. Upon reviewing this, I've realized that the rotation is too much, so select the camera, into the X rotation keyframes, and bring the final keyframe closer down so it's less intense. Re-render the viewport animation. It was way less intense and smoother now. Now we'll play with the lighting and the composition. First, hop into the View Layer tab, where you'll find a plethora of useful passes, which can be used as really powerful tools in compositing. But today we'll only use the mist pass and the denoising data. Turn those on. Before you render anything, I want to prepare the range of the mist pass. You'll see what I mean very soon. Select the camera and under Viewport Display, turn on the mist. You should now get a long line coming from the camera with a dot on each side. What this is, it's like a distance mask, which will color everything from black to white depending on how far away it is. And these 2 points are the start and the end of that gradient. Now the way we customize this mask is in the World tab in the Mist Pass dropdown, which only appeared because we turn on the Mist Pass in the View Layers tab. I want my mist pass to appear further away from the camera because in compositing, I'll apply an additional mist effect on top of all the fog that we have right here. And I don't want the foreground to be affected by this. Bring it out enough to encompass the whole forest so the effect is more gradual and slow. Now that we have the mist pass and the denoising data both active, we need to make a test render of the scene. Open the Render Properties tab, and in the Render dropdown, turn the denoise option off. We'll be doing that in the compositor with the denoising data pass. Now this is a test render, so I don't want to wait for ages, so we'll keep all the settings low quality and minimal. I'll set the render samples to about 50. Basically, the higher this number is, the more you have to wait, but the better and less noisy the results are. Now to render a single frame, just press F12. You start off with this checkerboard while the scene is loading up, then you'll get information rolling in on the top and the render will begin. First, it's all noisy, but the more samples go through, the better the quality of the render. We simply have to wait this out. Once it's done, you'll see your image in front of you. You can zoom in and analyze all you want. Now close this render window and open the Compositing tab up here. You'll start with an empty canvas, but I got some nodes in here because I was messing with this before as I was exporting different parts of the project. Click Use Nodes. You'll get a render layer node and a composite node. The render layer is what came out of the finished render that we just did, and the composite node is what will be exported from Blender once we're done. Anything we do in between these two nodes will affect the image. We call that compositing. First, I'll add a viewer node which will let me preview whatever I'm doing in the background and connect the render layer to it. When you zoom around, the background will stay still, which can be a little annoying. So what I like to do is turn off this background option here and just drag out a new window, change it into the UV editor, and then the preview texture is gonna be the viewer node. I'll also shift right-click drag across these two to put them in the same reroute, so whatever I plug in here will go both to the preview as well as to the output. We have a few outputs on the render layer node. The image itself, then the image's alpha, which is obviously white because we didn't render a transparent image, then the mist pass where you can see exactly what I meant when I said it's like a gradient from black to white depending on the distance from the camera, and all the denoising stuff. I'll plug the image back, and the first thing I want to do with this after it's done rendering is denoise it. So I'll add a denoise node and plug the image into image, normal to normal, and albedo to albedo. Wait for the compositing to be done and boom, the noise is gone. But the denoise node is very slow to compute, so I'll select it and press M to mute it, so it's gonna ignore it for now. The compositor is supposed to be almost real time. Now I'll make use of the mist pass to add even more fog to the scene. I want the mist to be the same color as the fog in my project. So I'll hop in my layout really quick, select the fog object, and copy the hexadecimal code value with Ctrl-C. Back in the compositor layout, I'll add a mix node, plug the main image into socket 1, and the copied color into socket 2. The slider blends between these two, and the mist pass will go directly into the factor. This has added fog only in the areas which are white, and whatever was white were the things that were very far away from the camera. So this added fog in faraway places. But the effect is too strong, so I'll add a math node and set it to multiply. And if you multiply anything with a number smaller than 1, you'll slowly approach 0. So the lower I put this number, the less the mist pass is gonna affect the image. If I mute the mix node, here's the before and the after. Now we'll add a glare node. This will take the highlight of my image and make it gloom and blow. Bloom and glow. I've been recording for 4 hours. Plug the result of the mix node into it, as this is the next step in the compositing chain. Set the quality to high and drop down the threshold. The threshold of 1 will only affect white pixels, and the lower that number goes, the darker colors will also be affected by the glare. If I put it to 0.2, you can see the house is now glowing, and the lower I drop it, the more parts of the image start glowing. If you want to preview only the glare effect, put the mix to 1. This is now only the glare effect in action. I'll change the streaks to fog glow for a natural fall off, and increase the size. The goal of this glare node is not to make the house highlights glow, it's to make the fireflies glow, and only the fireflies. So if I want the glare node to only detect the fireflies, I need to make them brighter than anything else on the image. So I'll hop back into my layout, select my firefly particle, and bring its emission strength up to 5. Press F12 to render a single image, still respecting our low quality settings. Because we've made updates, we have to re-render. The image should now be updated, so bring the mix up to 1 to preview. Now steadily raise the threshold until only the fireflies remain glowing. If the fireflies disappear before the house does, that means they're not bright enough, and you need to increase the emission strength again. Now that I've got this, I can put the mix back to 0 to see what it looks like. This is cool, but I wish the effect was stronger. Well, it is possible. Put the mix back to 1, so we've got only the glare effect, and then add a mix node, where we place our unglared image in the socket 1, and only the glare in socket 2. If we set the blending mode to add, it will simply add the glare on top of the image. The effect is the same as before, but the mix node lets you go above the strength of 1. If you click on it and type the value yourself, you can easily type a value of 5, and you have a really strong glaring effect on the fireflies. Another thing I want to add is the vignette effect. Add an ellipse mask and scale it so it roughly resembles a vignette. Then add a blur node and set it to something high, like 500. Then I'll add an alpha over node, which lets me put one thing on top of the other using the alpha channel. Alpha is transparency, so the first slot is the bottom layer and the second slot is the top layer. I'll do this before the glare, so the shine of the glare goes above the vignette. I'll put the blurred eclipse mask into the factor, and you can see it's revealing the image in the corners. That's because we have our image in the first slot, which is the bottom layer, and the white color is in the second slot, which is the top layer. We need to swap these inputs, and the white color will be overlaid in the corners, then change the white color to black, and we've got a vignette. Before, after. Next up, color correction. Add a color balance node after everything we've done so far. Now you have 3 color wheels called lift, gamma, and gain. Lift primarily affects the darker tones, gamma affects the middle tones, and gain mostly affects the lighter tones. You can use the color wheels to tint them, and you can use the sliders on the right to make them brighter or darker. I want to shift my darker tones towards the blue and my highlights towards orange to get some sort of a color contrast. I've put the gamma to blue as well because it feels more natural that way. I've also brought down the dark tones and lightened the bright ones for extra contrast. Before, after. Small tweak, since our camera is not moving a lot, I'll add another eclipse mask, position it, scale it roughly where the house would be, blur it a lot, then add a mix shader after everything, and use the new ellipse mask as the factor. There's now a white blob on the house because it's being mixed on top of the image. Change it to slightly yellow and change the blending type to overlay. This made the house stand out a little bit more. Before, after. It's a small change. And finally, add some camera defects. No lens is perfect. We have to add some lens distortion with the lens distortion node. Add a small amount of distortion. The image is now bulged like it was shot with a fisheye lens and has jumped out of the frame. To fix the frame, just click on Fit, which will scale the image in to cover the missing corners. But this bulge is still way too strong. Set it to something like 0.03. Now add a small amount of dispersion, also known as chromatic aberration. I've purposely added too much to show you what it looks like. It will offset the red and blue channels on the edges like it was scaled outwards, making them feel color distorted and blurry. This is a phenomenon that happens in lenses, because the red light wavelength is lower than blue light and they get bent at different angles. So sometimes, mostly with cheaper lenses, they don't meet on the camera sensor, they're offset a little bit. Set this to something very small, like 0.009. Observe the image and act accordingly. And this is it for the compositing. Go back to the layout and put in the proper render settings. Change the max sample size from 50 to something like 200. Usually would pick something like 1000, but I saw how good of a result the denoiser did, so maybe I can get away with low samples so it renders way faster. In the advanced dropdown, make sure this clock icon is active. This will sample a random noise pattern every frame, so the noise is randomized in every frame just like in real cameras. Tune in the exposure and gamma settings if you want, and finally go to the Output Properties tab and make a new folder on your project called 04_export, where we'll be rendering this too. We're doing it. Make sure the resolution is 1920 by 1080, frame rate is 25, the frames start and end match with your animation. Change the output location to the new export folder and give it a name, then change the file format from FFmpeg video to a PNG sequence. Usually I use OpenEXR for a wider color range and easier compositing, but for us PNG sequence is more than enough. Why an image sequence instead of a video file? Well, if Blender crashes while exporting a video file, you lose everything you've done, right? But if you export PNG images and Blender crashes, all of the previous ones are still saved. You don't lose any progress if Blender happens to crash while exporting. It's like a smart safety valve. Color RGB, we're not using any transparency on the export. Color depth, you can set it to 16 if you want a wider range of colors. You can drop down the compression if you want. Make sure that in the post-processing tab, compositing is turned on, which it is by default, just double checking. And now with all this done, drop down render and click render animation or press Ctrl and F12. Now the animation is rendering, just like before. It'll go up to 200 samples instead of 50 like before, and after the render is done, it'll apply all the compositing and then start on the next frame and keep doing that until it's over. But of course, your first render will never be your last, because you'll always discover issues. Like for me, the Fireflies started appearing after the animation has begun, so I need to tweak the particle spawn times, and there's some flickering on the trees, which I'm guessing was caused by the low sample size in the render, because the denoiser denoises every single frame individually, and if there's a lot of noise in the animation, sometimes it will flicker. So I need to increase the sample size to get less noise, and my denoiser will have to do less work and the result is going to be more consistent. So open the project again, set it to something more proper like 700, put the particles start and end time to 29. Like I've said before, should have done it this way from the start. I just lost 2 hours of rendering. That's why I have to make sure everything fits before you hit render, because you lose a lot of time if there's errors in there. Now re-render the animation, Ctrl and F12.
7 hours later.
Now with the project all exported, open a new Blender scene and change the viewport to the video sequencer. Open the Output Properties tab and set the frame rate to 25. The start of the animation to 30, the end to 155, so it all matches with the previous project. Then drop down Add and pick Image Sequence. Locate the rendered image sequence and press A to select everything and then import. Now select an output location, which I'll place in my main project folder, give it a name and set the file format to FFmpeg video. In the encoding dropdown, change the container to MPEG-4 and the video codec to H.264. The output quality to perceptually lossless, so the quality remains very good but the file size is not enormous, and set the encoding speed to slowest so it gives you the best compression efficiency. Now go to the render tab and scroll down to the color management. Make sure that the view transform is set to standard. We don't want to apply color transforms here because we applied the AGX color transform in the previous scene. We don't want to double apply it, we want to keep it standard so we don't touch the colors. And in the output properties, post-processing dropdown, make sure that the sequencer is ticked on. Again, it should be by default, but just double checking. Now press Ctrl and F12 to render, and this time we're only stitching images together, we have nothing in the scene, so it should be much faster. And in the end, you're left with this amazing 3D rendered scene of an abandoned house in the middle of the forest. And that concludes our course. We've learned how to navigate Blender and create beautiful works of art. We've tackled every department except animation and rigging. I didn't know where to fit that in, but I'll be glad to make a separate tutorial for this if you want. Let me know in the comments. I hope you found this course useful, and if you're ever stuck, you can always come back here and rewatch the video. I'll stay here forever. I also want to ask you to please join my Discord server and share your houses. I want to see your houses. I want to see what you've done with this course. Discord server, link in the description. If you enjoy the course, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing the course with other people. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay sharp.